Nick Saban is the greatest coach in college football history, and Alabama football is the definition of college football excellence. After they got destroyed by Clemson in the 2018 title and missed out on the 2019 college football playoff altogether, some asked if Nick Saban was losing his touch and if Clemson would take over as the new dynasty in power in college football. Anyone who actually knew what they were talking about knew that Alabama would bounce back and that Nick Saban would prove to the world why he was the best coach in the country, but some people were skeptical. This year, Mac Jones became one of the best quarterbacks in the country, Najee Harris was arguably the best running back in the nation, and Devontae Smith won the Heisman Trophy to put the icing on the cake. Alabama dominated this year, and they also dominated the 2020 college football playoff, and they would win another national championship. Alabama football is back to where we all expected them to be, and today we're going to be talking about the entire story of the 2020 season and how it all happened. First, if you love college football, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and share it with your friends to help it get in the algorithm, suggest what I should do next, and stay until the end. Now let's get started and talk about the 2020 Alabama Crimson Tide team. Today we'll go through the preseason expectations, the players, and the major storylines of the 2020 Crimson Tide season, and why the dynasty is back. Bama has been the definition of excellence for years, and the Tide were the main dynasty of the 2010 decade. In 2018, the Tide went all the way to the national title game, but they lost 44-16 to their biggest dynasty competitor, Clemson. Former Alabama player Dabo Swinney had taken over Clemson football, and with guys like Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence at quarterback, they had closed the gap to the Tide, and some thought that Clemson could take their spot. Again, this is what people thought, not what I actually thought was happening. In 2019, Alabama had a chance to put that talk back to rest with Tua Tagovailoa at quarterback and the most loaded wide receiver room in the history of college football, but they disappointed. You can blame it on the fact that they lost Tua to a serious hip injury, but before that, they had lost to Joe Burrow and LSU. Either way, Alabama missed the college football playoff after a loss to Auburn in the Iron Bowl, but they would destroy Michigan in the Citrus Bowl, and some did begin to ask the question, is Nick Saban losing his touch, and is Alabama football falling off? We all knew it wasn't, but going into 2020, the Tide had Steve Sarkisian as their offensive coordinator, and he was going to decide who the quarterback would be. Mac Jones had stepped in for Tua in 2019 and had shown some flash, but the fans and a lot of the media wanted to see what five-star Mater-Dei freshman Bryce Young could do, and a lot of people wanted him to be the starter, but Stark stuck with Mac, and it paid off. Najee Harris was going to be the starting running back, and many wondered if he would ever live up to the hype he had coming out of high school, and there were questions about the position's depth. At wide receiver, Devontae Smith came back for his senior year, Jalen Waddle was a star, and Miller Forristall was an experienced tight end. Outside of those guys, though, John Mechie, Xavier Williams, Slade Bolden, and Jaleel Billingsley were the next young Tide stars, but who was going to step up, and there were questions about the playmakers. Patrick Surtain was one of the best corners in the country, Dylan Moses was a star at linebacker, and Christian Harris was a young star player at the linebacker position group as well. Fansided believed that Alabama was going to go 10-0 and make it to the playoff, and I thought the exact same thing. Of course, they opened up the season with a road game against Missouri, which is my team if you didn't know, and Bama looked terrific in that game as Jalen Waddle had almost 200 yards receiving and Najee Harris had 3 touchdowns, and this was actually one of the closer games of the season, and I'm actually surprised Missouri put that much of a fight up against this team, knowing how good Alabama would become. Against Texas A&M, the Tide dominated, and Mac Jones threw for 435 yards, and John Mechie had a breakout game with 181 yards receiving. A&M would get better as the year went on, but in Week 3, the Tide were struggling in a shootout against Ole Miss. Najee Harris had 206 yards and 5 touchdowns, and Nick Saban took care of his former assistant Lane Kiffin in what was a pretty fun game. At this point, Mac Jones was becoming a star, Najee was blowing up, and Devontae Smith was slowly building Heisman momentum. The following week, they were matched up with number 3 Georgia. Stetson Bennett was the quarterback for Georgia, sadly, and the Tide rolled over the Bulldogs behind big games from both Mac Jones and Devontae Smith. Against Tennessee, Bama got a huge blow as they lost Jalen Waddle to injury on the opening kickoff, and someone would need to step up at wide receiver. John Mechie took that to heart and became the number 2 option on the team, and Alabama easily beat Tennessee on the third Saturday of October game behind Mac's arm and 3 touchdowns from Najee Harris. They shut out Mississippi State 41-0 the following week, and you could say they got revenge from the previous year with the injury to Tua. The highly anticipated rematch with LSU was postponed to later in the season, and in a 66-3 win over Kentucky, the future of the running back position was on display as Jase McClellan had 100 yards and a touchdown in their win. They would blow through both Auburn and LSU in the next 2 weeks, and at that point, Devontae Smith had become a trendy pick for the Heisman Trophy. They killed Arkansas to finish the SEC slate at 10-0, and they would be matched up with Florida in the SEC championship game. For a while, Kyle Trask seemed to be the frontrunner for the trophy, but that all came to a screeching halt after a shoe toss and an embarrassing loss to LSU at home. This was still going to be a fun matchup though, and Alabama got out to a lead, and it looked like they were going to win. Florida would fight back though and made it fun at the end, but they couldn't tie it up and Bama won. Late in the game, offensive lineman anchor Landon Dickerson actually got injured, and his emotion and passion got the team so fired up that this story was in the spotlight of the media, and it really showed the bond that this Alabama team had. In a shocking surprise, Alabama was selected into the 2020 college football playoff, and they would be matched up with Notre Dame in the first round. At the same time, Devontae Smith would win the Heisman, and both Najee Harris and Mac Jones finished in the top 5. Against Notre Dame, Devontae Smith and Mac Jones went off as they won the game 31-14. I would actually say Notre Dame's defense did a pretty solid job of stopping Alabama, but the Irish would fall again, and Bama was one win away from a title. Ohio State would kill Clemson in the 2-3 matchup, and at this point, many thought the Tide were going to easily beat the Buckeyes because Ohio State's defense just wasn't elite. I never really thought it was going to be much of a matchup, to be honest, and a lot of people felt the same way, and we all thought Bama was going to dominate this game, and they're just kind of a team of destiny. In his last collegiate game, Mac Jones had almost 500 yards and 4 touchdowns, and Devontae Smith had 200 yards and 3 touchdowns in his going-out party. It was never close in the second half, and even an injured Landon Dickerson would get a chance to play 2 snaps in the victory formation, and Alabama won the 2021 National Championship game. This was Saban's 7th title, and he passed Bear Bryant for the most titles of any coach, and he is now the greatest coach in college football history, if he was not already. Here's what Nick Saban had to say, and I think it's a really good quote that you guys need to hear. A reporter asked this: "Coach Saban, this was a season unlike any other. What did your team have to endure and overcome to stand here as champs?" Saban responded with, quote, "Well, I think perseverance probably is the one word that describes this team the best in terms of what they've had to overcome all season long. I'm so proud of these guys. This was a team that was always together. Everybody bought into all the principles and values of the organization and the program. They just did a great job. They played together, they supported each other. This is a great team." Nick Saban doesn't show a ton of emotion, and he's all business. This is exactly the kind of response I would have expected out of him. I had a pretty good time watching the 2020 Alabama team. This is one of the best teams in college football history, in my opinion. The offense was so explosive, the storylines were spectacular, and it just goes to show you that Alabama football was never going away. Mac Jones, Najee Harris, and Devontae Smith should all be first-round picks from this offense, and I think Jalen Waddle can still be a day-1 selection despite his injury, and I am pumped to see how these guys will do in the NFL. Bryce Young, Jace McClellan, and John Mechie will be the young guys who will become the next group of stars for the Tide. I do expect them to take a step back next year, but that's very relative because they will still win the West, be in the playoff, and likely get all the way to the title game and probably win it. It's good to see Nick Saban and the Tide are back in business, and roll Tide.